Hi, Daniel.
Good to see you again.
So today we try really differently. We do a monothematical Europe podcast, okay?
Sounds great. Love that.
Let's see. Straightforward. You are European. You have created one of the most successful and biggest European companies. Your role model has always been Silicon Valley. Why do you care about Europe?
Well, I think it starts kind of with where you started, which is I'm European. I'm born here. I've been incredibly fortunate to grow up in Sweden, but also because of many other advancements in technology, whether it's airplanes and trains and so on, been able to experience the amazing culture of Europe. And for me, it is the greatest place on earth. It is the culture, the diversity, it's the food, it's so many things. It's the languages. It's just an amazing place to be.
Interesting that you're saying that, because I totally agree. I think it is the beauty of Europe, the quality of life, also in a way the safety of life. You could say also a certain balance, a social balance, diversity, intellectual property, all that defines Europe. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that if we look to the performance of Europe, it's not doing so well. Europe is not delivering on over-proportional growth, is not delivering on innovation, is not playing an instrumental part in AI developments. Europe is overregulated. Europe is too bureaucratic. America is almost giving up on Europe. The world is kind of almost looking down at Europe because people don't get it, why Europe is not kind of performing better. So what's wrong? Where's the problem? Why is that?
Yeah, it's an interesting framing, and obviously it's one that I also hear a lot. It's the sort of, in a much simpler framing, I think people call it, Europe is the museum of the world. I just don't know that I agree with the framing. I totally, see what other people are seeing, that there's better economic growth elsewhere than perhaps what Europe has delivered in the past 20 years. And we certainly have our share of challenges, but I think every society does. I think certainly America does. I think certainly many of the Asian countries do as well, as just one example. So for me, I choose to look at this as sort of more the glass is half full rather than the glass is half empty. And what I see instead is that the world has, if you really dumb it down over the past 20, 30 years, essentially all come down to the power of the internet and the power of software eating the world, as Mark Andreessen famously said. And there, if you sort of look at the progress in economic terms, that's been the major driver, certainly Europe has underperformed. But I think the key portion for me that I think is the most important one is it's not underperformed on the basis of talent. It's underperformed on the basis that we haven't built amazing software and internet companies here at the same scale that, for instance, the US or, for instance, that China has. So I kind of look at it and sort of say if you look at it from economic progress, it really comes down to that when you look at it. And then, going forward, I think the most important thing we can do is obviously rectify that, and to take a famous Wayne Gretzky quote, skate to where the puck is going, not necessarily to where it is at the moment. And if we do that and we do that well, I think Europe has amazing potential.
Daniel, would you consider yourself a European patriot, or are you first and foremost Swedish? What is your identity?
Yeah, it's one where I struggle with it even myself quite a bit. Because I on the one hand, obviously, is incredibly Swedish. I have two Swedish parents. I have a wife that's Swedish as well. So in many ways, I'm incredibly Swedish. But I'm born in the early 80s, which means I was an internet native generation. And so for me, I'm truly a globalist in that sense too, where the internet, many of my friends I met on the internet and later formed deep friendships with all over the world. And the European part of myself actually is more of a recent take. And, even during COVID, I really, really, not being able to travel as extensively as I had been, I sort of reaffirmed my love for Europe in a much bigger way. So these days, I would definitely say that I've realized more and more, having traveled the world, just how amazing Europe is and how much I care about both protecting what we already have, but honestly also making sure that Europe in the future is prosperous.
I mean, we both love Europe, and I think for good reasons. We said it, the lifestyle is unique, and it could be the magnet for talent from all around the world. But if our love is honest, we also have to admit that it's not doing that. Europe is not the magnet for the best talent all around the world. And so we have to be honest, something is wrong. Or in any case, Europe is performing below its potential. And you could say, I mean, my mother used to say it, the ultimate form of love is criticism. So let's focus on the room for improvement. What needs to change in order to unlock the real potential of Europe?
Well, I think structurally and fundamentally, I do believe that we in Europe are underinvesting in research and development, so R&D, and in every way. I think we're underinvesting in science. I think we're underinvesting in research. I think we're underinvesting in corporate R&D projects to try to grow our corporations much better too. And we can obviously try to dissect why that is the case, but I think one of the more foundational structural thing that is incredibly important if you go back to the early 20th century is that much of the R&D and much of the innovation essentially was financed by banks, and banks had that charter within them to actually take a lot of risks and enable a lot of new businesses to come up. And there was a great sort of push by governments to invest in research to a great extent. And if you look at sort of what's certainly happened over the last 20, 30 years, a lot of that has changed with the advent of venture capital as a new formal way of financing R&D, with regulation on the banking side that means that banks no longer play the same role in innovation that they used to do and enable that. And then with sort of the hyper capital markets, which, really look towards, very hyper efficient companies, which tends to also be capital efficient companies, which means things like R&D and other things may not be invested to the same extent. So if you take the confluence of all of these things together, I believe that it's just a structure where Europe hasn't really adapted to the same extent that it should be. And therefore, we've underinvested in research, and that means we've underinvested in innovation. And if we're underinvesting in innovation, I certainly believe that's the pinnacle and the most important ingredient for us to get right in order to get prosperity right, because that leads to growth, new jobs, a future positive outlook.
When we last spoke about Europe and its investment culture, you suggested a very concrete thing, basically saying if we would save 1% less and invest that into startups, we would have a different environment. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so talking about sort of the glass is half full versus it's half empty. I mean, I think this is a pretty startling perspective. So it's undoubtedly so that the U.S. economy has grown much faster over the last 20 years than the European economy has. And that's true. And if you double click on that, you can see that pretty much all of it has to do with its R&D spend on software, getting all of these things sort of right, and really kind of investing in the future. Meanwhile, so it's easy then to say, okay, well, they got ahead. But I think it's important to state that where Europe is now, if we look at sort of raw opportunities, is we have 33 trillion euros in savings sitting on the sidelines. That is a massive amount of capital. It's about 10x the amount that the US has in savings sitting on the sidelines. So I think it's actually between 8 to 10x, but it's significantly more in savings than America has, as an example. So if we took 1% of that, just 1%, and put that in new innovation, so let's take venture capital as an asset class as just one example of this, we would more than double the entire venture capital landscape in Europe. So I think that that's a very simple way to think about that we have a lot of potential levers to pull here in order to shift how we think about R&D, how we think about our innovation.
It sounds mathematical, but it is in the end very cultural. It requires a different mentality, more of a risk taker's mentality. Why is it that risk is way more popular, way more rewarded in the United States and elsewhere in the world, and to a certain degree almost discredited in Europe? If you dare to do something bold and unconventional and you fail, you're basically done. In Europe, the second chance is rare. In America, people are saying, well, nice try it again. They encourage you. Or they would even go that far to say a guy or a girl who failed in doing something will do much better next time. In any case, she or he learned from that experience, from that failure. And so risk is a positive thing. People are encouraged to take risks, and if they fail, they are encouraged to try again. What needs to be done in order to change the European mentality in that direction and to make us more risk taker, to create more of a risk taker culture here?
Yeah, I mean, it is actually something that I think a lot about because at the end of the day, I completely agree with you. One of the biggest barriers we have in Europe is a mentality barrier. And I think it stems from the fact that we in so many places have essentially been playing a zero-sum game. If we in one way need to grow, then clearly something else must lose. But that is just not how I view the world. I think what's so amazing about the concept of the economy is that it can actually grow. It is not a fixed pie. It is a growing pie. And growing the GDP, is one of the most important things we can do in order to increase prosperity for everyone. And so it ought to be in everyone's best interest. And I completely agree with you in terms of that this is one of the big things that we spend a lot of time in analysis of our failures. And it certainly has some value, so I'm not going to discount that. But in my experience, I think we tend to overestimate the downside and underestimate the upside in many cases. And in the investing world, there's usually a saying between sort of errors of commission or errors of omission. Omission means basically what you didn't do. And it tends to really, certainly when you think about technology, and as I look back at sort of my 20 years at Spotify, the things I regret the most isn't the mistakes I made, it's the things that I actually didn't do. I think a lot about that. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, culturally for Europe, this is a massive thing for us to try to get right. I don't pretend to know how to fix this because I think it's very deeply rooted. But I think one of the big things that media can do is obviously start painting more stories, not just of the ones that are failing, but about also the ones that are succeeding. And I realized that it probably aren't as engaging of stories to tell. But I think subtly, if we start celebrating more of the successes that exist in Europe, it would be a remarkable positive story. I mean, for me, I think it's so cool to just think about how, take this company ASML, I don't think that is a super well-reported story, how important that company from Netherlands is for the world at the moment. I also don't think it's a well-reported story that Revolut might be one of the most, if not the most, important fintech company in the world. Both of these are European companies, and we can keep adding more and more of these. There's a German company called ISAR Aerospace that had a space launch more recently. I didn't even realize we had a space company in Europe, but it does turn out that there are all of these amazing companies that, for whatever reason right now, aren't properly getting their stories out there. So I think media has a big role to play in balancing the critical reporting, which I think is important, but also to play the optimist game.
Okay, Daniel, I accept the challenge since you are throwing the ball in my direction, a guy who is in charge for a media company, to make sure that we have more kind of encouraging and positive stories. Just to correct a stereotype, the stereotype that only bad news are good news or only bad news are kind of increasing reach, it's wrong. Actually, it's the opposite. People are pretty fed up by it. And so more uplifting stories, positive stories, sharing success is actually something that even works from a reach point of view. And so absolutely no objections from my side to do so. But we really then need the positive examples. You are definitely one. And when you basically launched, when you founded Spotify, you took big risks. I would like to understand why. So would you say it is something that is genetic? It's your mother that encouraged you, or the genes that enabled you? Or is it also something that is societal, that is cultural, that is in the end also political, where societies and leaders in society can make a difference? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously hard to sort of self-diagnose oneself, and certainly I don't know to what extent was genetic versus sort of environmental. But what I can say that I think is interesting, in the US, entrepreneurs often talk about there being no option than succeeding, because failure means essentially you end up on the streets. I have had quite the opposite reason for going big on a personal basis, which is I knew that whatever I would do, I would not end up on the streets. I would still always being able to feed myself, have a roof over my head. So I figured the option for going for greatness, actually, the cost of failing wasn't very high. And the upside, if we succeeded, because, I loved music and I loved technology, so to be able to put those two things together and hopefully in a way grow the music industry again, which at the time was really hurt by piracy, it just felt like a very good sort of asymmetric opportunity where there was lots of upside and not much downside.
But Daniel, may I just double click on that point that you mentioned? You said that you didn't feel that risk to end up on the street, but that is not because you were born in a particularly wealthy or privileged family, according to my knowledge. So what gave you that certainty? What gave you that feeling of I can take risks because I will not end up with nothing? Where does it come from?
Well, I think it comes from, in my case, this Swedish social model. A little told story is that, there was a period of time when I didn't have a job. And for a few months, I managed to get by with friends, but I was this close to getting on a welfare program. And you're right. I come from a working class. My mother, brought me up. She was working in a kindergarten as a teacher in the kindergarten, so it's not a super well paid job. We didn't have a lot of money, but I knew I could always return to her. And I could probably get a welfare check to survive and keep doing what I wanted to do. And those didn't feel like bad options to me.
But that is now really interesting, because if I get it right, what you are saying is basically the social welfare system, the European social welfare system, is actually helpful to educate risk takers. The opposite theory would say, no, the more Darwinistic American model, where you basically have nothing, the social security net is almost inexistent, that encouraged people to take risks, to go for it, to be more ambitious. So would you really say that the European social model is breeding risk takers?
Well, I mean, I think I don't think it's a one size fits all, and I think this is the mistake we do even when we look at sort of school, and we tend to sort of I think the future of education isn't that it's going to be lecture based and everyone has to do a written exam. I think that different people learn in different ways. And similarly, I think that there are different motivations for people to take risks. And as you rightly pointed out right now, perhaps one of the most contrarian viewpoints I have is that the Darwinistic system that the whole world think is the essential ingredient in order to promote entrepreneurship and innovation, certainly in my case was not true. It was the opposite. I am quite convinced that I would have never dared to be an entrepreneur if I thought that there was a huge risk that I might end up on the streets and not be able to provide a meal for myself. And now the inverse can also be true. If you feel like you're getting everything provided for you, and there's really no upside in striving for anything greater, then why go through with something as painful as starting a company, taking on all the naysayers, changing, a business or an industry or whatever it is that you're going through. So I think both extremes can be true, but I think if we channel, I think for a lot of people, this welfare model means that there's an essential ability for you to go for greatness. Let me take it in another domain to make the point. So my home country, Sweden, is one of the biggest net exporters of music in the world, of songwriters and music. And I often get this question, like, why are we so successful? And I think it actually comes down to two critical components. One of those components is the fact that we have very, very affordable music education from a very young age. It almost costs nothing to learn how to play music, which is an amazing thing and is broadly encouraged in society as a way of developing yourself to also learn an instrument and learn how to play, which I think for me has been an amazing, privilege, but also an amazing thing just to broaden my own horizons. But the other part, why I think we have a lot of people who are really successful is because similarly, again, many of those people, as I've been talking to songwriters, many of them in the early days, even the most successful ones, it wasn't sort of up and to the right. Many of them struggled, they had to take some extra jobs in order to survive, but some of them got on welfare in order to succeed in addition to that. But for them, it was just such an important calling in their life that they really didn't care, and it wasn't sort of this sort of necessity that they couldn't do music, and it wasn't a hindrance because economically that wasn't the only driver for them. This was such an important sort of personal thing for them to pursue. So the point that I'm trying to say is that I think for some people the Darwinistic model might be the better way to sort of push them towards doing this thing. But for some people, it's actually the opposite. It's the safety that allows them to think freely and pursue their passion. And that passion in the end means longevity, which I believe is a huge correlator to also being really good into something and then being successful.
So, Daniel, we can perfectly agree on this. It's not black and white, and both models work. And your analogy or example is perfect because let's take the other big music hubs in the world. It's London, it's Los Angeles, it's New York. And I think the three of them are Darwinistic, and there are no or very little safety nets. They are super competitive and super brutal and nevertheless extremely productive. So I would absolutely agree with you. Both can be successful, and it's not an either or. So if it's not that, what is it then that makes the difference in objective success KPIs in Europe and in other markets, if we take it in the bigger context of tech and value creation and AI and innovation? It must be something different. And that brings us to regulation. Ronald Reagan famously said, European business policy is, if a business moves, tax it. If it still moves, regulate it. And if it's dead, subsidize it. That may be a little exaggerated, but only a little. So is regulation then a fundamental problem in Europe, or is that also exaggerated and misleading?
Yeah, I maybe wrongly, I try to more often than not focus on elements that are more within my control. And so the question I oftentimes ask is it a barrier? Is it such a big barrier that it completely inhibits anyone from creating such a company? Or is it a barrier to scale a company, and ultimately sort of is it a barrier to succeed? And where I fall on regulation in Europe, I certainly would like to, on average, see more ability for companies to grow faster. The Capital Markets Union is a great example of this, making regulation easier for people to start new companies. Why is it easier for me to purchase stock in a company? I can do that in 2 minutes, but setting up a company in certain jurisdictions can be months. That makes no sense to me, and we should absolutely 100% fix those issues. But I also wonder sometimes if it's truly a barrier to creation. And I've yet to come across an entrepreneur that have said to me, I couldn't start my company in Europe. It was impossible. I've come across entrepreneurs that have said it's been easier to start a company in this jurisdiction than another one. But it's incredibly rare. So let me take two concrete examples where I think Europe is behind and absolutely should fix, and one where surprisingly Europe is ahead, but we don't talk about it. And so where we're behind, I think, is on energy. Our energy regulation is a massive barrier for a lot of things, not just in tech, but I think it's a massive barrier for industry, for our competitiveness, that the energy prices are much higher in Europe than it is in America and other places in the world. And we have a lot of work to do on the regulatory front to enable more investments so that we can get energy prices down, so we can increase the ability for industries to grow and invest in Europe. There, I think it's 100% clear that we need to do a lot more than what we're doing. Now, the offside of that...
Should we go back to nuclear energy?
Personally, I'm a huge proponent for using as many different energy mixes as we can, nuclear being a great example of that, of course. I do think we need to do even more on the renewable side in addition to that, but a good mix of various things are going to be needed, I believe.
But do you think it's, sorry to double click, but do you think it's a mistake of Germany to drop out of nuclear energy?
I don't know Germany's situation specifically, and I don't know if at the moment it is the right thing, but if I look back and say sort of in hindsight, with everything that we know, should nuclear have been a bigger part of the mix, given the safety records of the newer things, etc.? I'm not an expert, but the answer seems quite obvious that yes, we should have invested more in nuclear. I had a
conversation with Sam Altman about his project of Stargate Europe. He wanted to invest 100 billion in Europe and ideally in Germany. And he has a hard time to do in Germany because there's not enough energy and he needs either French or Czech nuclear energy. Otherwise, it's not possible. So we are setting ourselves limits by excluding that form of very efficient energy production.
Absolutely so. And I don't think that's the only example, by the way. I think that there's a lot of traditional industries that could grow much better if it had access to more affordable energy. So I think it's a competitive area where we should frame it as such. We need to get energy prices down because that's going to make us more competitive, rather than ideologically what sort of energy mix, etc. And then we should just, I think if we didn't call it nuclear and called it something else, the debate would probably be very different. But it's such a strong association with a particular word. It's almost ironic, I feel, at this point. But energy mix is one thing, but let me take the other example why I think this question is more nuanced than just sort of Europe is overregulated. So on the financial side, fintech side, it's quite interesting because I would argue that Europe has better regulation than many places in the world, and certainly in many cases than America does. And we can already see the fruits of that labor. So if you look at the sort of greatest fintech companies in the world, many of them are European. So you got the Adyen's, you got Revolut, you got Klarna, you got Checkout.com, you got many of these fintech companies are European. And when you looked at, for instance, much of the innovation around tokenization of assets, etc., what Robinhood released, they did in Europe first because honestly the regulation isn't even done there. So this is an area where American companies are coming to Europe, innovating to then be able to take it to America and not the other way around. So I think that speaks volumes that it's not sort of just that Europe overregulates everything. There are areas where Europe already is very good on the regulatory in the regulatory domain. There's areas where we're definitely behind, and on average we can probably do with less regulation and innovate, make more innovation-friendly policies across the board, like for instance on AI. Those are all, I think, quite obvious examples where Europe can do better, but I don't think it's a fundamental barrier for why we're not seeing more entrepreneurship, and I want to be clear about that.
But Daniel, let me give you just one example. As a German, I was shocked by a number that I just discovered last week. The German job agency, so a very official source, was releasing an information that Germany has created over the last 3 years, 325,000 jobs in German companies that were created just in order to deal with bureaucracy, with regulatory issues. So in a way, Germany has almost created more jobs to deal with bureaucracy and regulation than jobs that are really doing the work, the actual work. And that's ironic, and I think in any case unhealthy. So we can argue regulation is not the only reason why Europe is underperforming, but I think it is definitely a factor of it. And so my question to you would be, do you have any idea what should be done? I mean, shouldn't we simply say a new regulation, a new law can only be launched if 2 others are going away? So isn't it that we need more concrete measures in order to really lower the hurdles of bureaucracy and regulation, or in any case make it smarter, so that in the end it encourages people to take risks, to come up with new ideas, to launch companies or projects?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and I'm not saying that there aren't things we can't do better on the regulatory side. But I also wonder. Sometimes I do believe you are what you measure. And so rather than talking about sort of less regulation for the sake of less regulation, I think what we're trying to address here, which is more the critical point, is how do we increase innovation? So, a better part would be measure all new regulations or removal of regulations against, in a theoretical world. If we were able to define a single KPI that said the pace of innovation in Europe or European competitiveness, and evaluate whether we're doing the right measures against that, or actually by introducing new things potentially hindering innovation, I think those things would be if it was possible to do that, I think that would be the right approach. And I do think that in some instances, what could actually be helpful, as ironic as it sounds, is a different regulation in a field might enable that to be more innovative. And in another field, it might be removing regulation, as you rightly pointed out. But I do want to be clear.
Do we need iterative regulation? So instead of working for 2 years on a new law, on a new regulation, start something quick and then adapt if things are moving? Because I sometimes the impression that the companies are moving so fast that regulation is always lagging behind.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not an expert, but I worry about regulating too early before we understand fully the consequences of a certain type of field. I think it's a different things about when there's already a proven and a mature playing field and regulating in order to simplify and enable more innovation. So again, take fintech as a great example. I really do believe that with MiCA, MiCA, and LTIF 2.0 and some of these new regulation, it is super, super cool and super innovative, because essentially Europe on crypto, blockchains, many of these things now have EU-wide regulation already in place that enables that in a way that, for instance, America currently does not. And this is an area, by the way, which is really problematic in the US. So in that case, the regulation was actually quite helpful, I believe, in putting to place. And in other places, we have too much regulation and it's slowing us down. And so I wonder if the better part here isn't to kind of have different approaches for different areas. I totally believe, like you said, that an iterative approach to regulation might work as a way of testing in various places and maybe even a country, and start there and see how that goes, and then sort of broaden it out. Because one of the big problems is we have to, in EU, get 27 countries to agree, and it's sometimes hard just because it's a theoretical construct before we can see the evidence.
Well, that makes us slow. And since you mentioned America, I think that touches upon a very big issue, the transatlantic relationship, which is in a deep crisis. And America basically has turned away from Europe. Now we can blame the present government and can say they're isolationist and anti-European, but we could also simply in a more pragmatic way discuss what can we Europeans do in order to make sure that America remains interested in Europe, that America understands that it needs Europe in order to solve the big issues, the big challenges in the world: China, Russia, Islamist aggressors and terrorist regimes, economic trade relationships, where a trade war between America and Europe is the most counterproductive and the least thing that we need in order to really come up to terms with China in a beneficial way for the Western world and the open society model. So my concrete question is, do you have any ideas what Europe should do, could do in order to make sure that America remains an ally?
I think you already posted. I think the most important thing that we can and should be doing is create amazing technologies and innovation in Europe. If we do that, we will create amazing businesses and create amazing prosperity, and other countries and regions will want to trade even more with Europe, and that becomes a sort of soft power where we have an even bigger seat at the table than perhaps we have at this moment. And again, I think from an industrial perspective in the 20th century, we certainly had that. Certainly in the later part where much of our economy was growing, we had some of the world's leading companies in many, many industries. That's still the case. But the reality is much of the world, as we started this conversation, has been about software. And there we've certainly lagged behind. And my concern, and worry is, of course, that now again the game is being redesigned to be one about not just software, but I put it as if the world was about bits, the world is now about bits, atoms, and genes being pulled together, and it's really, really important, I believe, that Europe becomes a leader in those new fields as software gets into the world of atoms, as software gets into the world of genes, so that we can create the next generation of best-in-class biotech companies, best-in-class new industrial companies, robotics, quantum, all of these other, amazing fields that will become even bigger parts of the economy going forward. Again, maybe to take a step back, I think the world tends to look at things black and white. It tends to be thinking about these things as zero sum. Someone has to win in order for someone to win, someone has to lose. That is just not how I view the world. I view the world as we can grow together. It will be an expanding pie. But in order to have the expanding pie, technology is the ultimate enabler for that to happen. And I think technology can solve many of the biggest issues that we're facing in the world, whether it is climate change, whether it is inequality, whether it is healthcare or education. I think technology will play a critical role in solving those problems. And therein, we as Europe should invest more in that future and innovation.
Nevertheless, in a world where technology, bits and bots and genes are playing a bigger and bigger role, we are suddenly seeing something that seemed almost outdated, out of a old century, but is very present, and that's war. And it's very close to our borders. It's war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, or you could say it's a Russian war on Europe. We have war in the Middle East. We have potential conflicts between China and Taiwan. That is also a topic that you care a lot about. That's why you invested in Helsing, in a defense company. How do you see the role of military conflicts, of wars, also in the context of the transatlantic relationship? Is that something that can bring Europe closer together and can bring America and Europe again closer together? Or is it something that will further disentangle us and will widen the gap between Europe and America, because America at a certain point may say, well, that's your problem, you got to fix it?
Yeah, I don't know and pretend to know that I know how the world will unfold. But what we can say with great certainty is that I believe that Europe is certainly at a size enough and at a values perspective enough where it's very important that we can defend ourselves, and that we shouldn't have to rely on anyone else to defend ourselves.
But can we defend ourselves today?
I think it's debatable. But in my future sort of worldview and future hope scenario, I certainly hope and believe that if you think about the fact that we are still a very sizable, if you take all of Europe together, a very, very sizable economy. We have 400 to 500 million people in the region. That is a sizable enough economy. It's a sizable enough population that it is kind of strange to me from a first principles basis just to say that we would have to rely on a nation of 300 people to protect ourselves. And so that's from the basis that I operate. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't collaborate and have strong alliances and strong relationships with like-minded partners. That is not what I'm saying. But I am saying that where perhaps I agree with America is that Europe needs to play a bigger role in its own defense. And I believe that it's really important, and I don't understand why, from a mentality standpoint, we can't think of that with our size and our institutions, that why we shouldn't be able to protect ourselves without the reliance on anyone else. And that's how I think about this. And I think a strong defense is the best deterrence from any future conflict.
Okay, here is perhaps the first bigger point where we slightly disagree. I mean, I agree on the aspect that the more sovereignty and strength Europe can develop with regard to defense, the better it is. And also it helps to be taken seriously by America. But in the end, I truly think that the bigger challenges of our times can only be solved in an alliance of democracies and in an alliance of open societies. And that means concretely as a basis for that in a transatlantic alliance. I think the three biggest conflicts or potential conflicts, the one between Russia and Ukraine, the one between Islamists and Israel, and the one between China and Taiwan, have one common denominator, and it's the attack on the open society model. It's the attack on democracy. It's the effort to weaken the open society model, a free society model, and to disentangle democracies, in particularly Europe and America. If we let that happen, they will win, not we. And it will weaken the lifestyle that we have described at the beginning, that you could even call the European lifestyle to a certain degree. And that's why I truly think all ideas that we should do things alone and that we should be independent, they sound nice, but in the end, they are unrealistic. They are naive. We have seen it. We cannot solve the issues in the Middle East, and we haven't really involved ourselves there. We haven't solved the problems between Ukraine and Russia, and we were way too soft at the beginning and gave Putin way too much time in order to basically regroup and get stronger. And that is particularly true for the biggest conflict of all and the role that China is going to play. So I really think we have to stick together, and a good definition of common interests, not that much a moral discussion, what is desirable, but more a discussion what is needed, what is necessary to defend our interests. That's what would be also the most beneficial for Europe. And that's why I'm so obsessed by this idea that we have to make sure that America understands, yeah, Europe may be difficult, maybe too slow, maybe too bureaucratic, but they need us. We need them, but they also need us, because otherwise America is a former superpower and weaker than ever.
Yeah, so to be very clear, I don't know that I believe that there's much of a disagreement between the 2 points we have. So to be clear, I'm not stating that I don't believe in the transatlantic relationship. I absolutely do, and I think it is created so much prosperity indirectly for the fact that we didn't have wars for a long period of time because of the strength of that transatlantic relationship. Now, but my point is rather that I believe that Europe has and needs to do a bigger part in that relationship. And when it comes to its own security and defense, I still don't believe we should be in a position where, for the basics of defending ourselves, we should be reliant on any third party nation. I do believe we should be in the relationship, and if we're stronger in that relationship, we can also be a better partner to everyone else, whether it is in our own region or potentially in a larger transatlantic basis too. So that's maybe a nuance to the point I made, but I think is perhaps an important one to state as well. I'm not sort of advocating that Europe goes alone in this future and ignores America, but I think that it is, from a first principle basis, kind of crazy that we, have accepted a position where 450 million people are reliant on another nation of 300 million to defend itself. I think we should be able to do that ourselves if we had to. Not that we should at all costs to do it, but we should be able to do it if we had to.
Now, the good news is that a lot is happening in Europe. Some very kind of successful new AI-driven defense companies are launched and are gaining traction. So that's a positive. I would like to know to which degree we are now, with regard to the big budget allocations, counting and focusing really on the future defense products, or to a certain degree are still too conservative and counting too much on old school defense ideas and tools. What's your view on that?
I think the jury honestly is still out on it. So you're right, and maybe for the framing of other people, there's an enormous amount of uptake in terms of spending from historically very low levels to now very high levels, way above the original NATO targets. But we're coming from a position where we have underinvested for a long period of time. So some of that is we gotta simply get to a good base level by having raw materials. But we also, as you rightly pointed out, have to invest in the future too. And I think the jury's still out whether we are doing and accomplishing both of those objectives. But I am seeing positive signs. And I think this is a way where, again, the ability here, the upside case for Europe would be that we can accomplish both, right? Because there's this other debate that's happening in this. At what expense are we now trying to protect ourselves? What are the other things we're not doing? And I think that because of new technology, we can, much more cheaply be in a position where we can defend ourselves, and hopefully also do it in such a way where there's a lot less cost on human lives than historical conflicts have been. And that's the upside scenario that I want, which is much more deterrence without potentially risking human lives. And I think the primary way of doing that is mass and autonomy. So I think that we need more things, and we need them to be more intelligent than they've been before. And if we succeed with that, it is actually possible to creating a bigger deterrence than anyone we've seen before. And I think Ukraine is a great example of that.
You mentioned deterrence. I met 2 days ago Eric Schmidt, and we spoke about deterrence. He has the idea that the accelerated developments and progress in drone production, and particularly micro drones, will lead to a scenario where drones are so dangerous that they create a symmetrical deterrence, that no country dares to really launch a big micro drone attack on another one, because what they get in return is equally destructive. So that would lead to an almost optimistic outlook that this accelerated developments of super dangerous drones can lead to a symmetrical deterrence that is very similar to the times of the Cold War, and creates peace, or at least stability. The other theory, the counter theory to Eric Schmidt's theory, is that because of these developments, drones in the hands of evil forces, of terrorists, will get completely out of control with the help of AI, fire back, and destroy in a dimension that seems unimaginable today. So between this very optimistic peace scenario and the very destructive dystopian scenario, where are you?
Perhaps to a fault, I'm always the optimist in the room, and I tend to believe that, however, when it comes to this, regardless of which where you fall on this, I think the only rational conclusion you can make is that you need to invest in AI and new defense in these new capabilities. Because I think in the most negative scenario that you just outlined, I think the solution to that is counter drones. So if you see a lot of drones in the sky, you need counter drones to take those drones down. That is the most cost-effective way. If you look at the conflict at the moment, where various sides are using very expensive equipment. For a drone that costs $1,000 on one side, you're using $1 million dollar thing to take it down. It's obviously not going to scale, and it's not going to be possible to do that. But if you're using $1,000 drone on one side and $1,000 drone on the other side, or even better, a $50 drone on the other side, it is totally possible to neutralize any sort of threat scenarios, even if it's not from a nation state that you talked about, but a terrorist organization. Now, I do want to be clear with all of these things. These are incredibly tricky topics, and if you'd asked me 20 years ago whether I would ever get involved in a field like this, that wouldn't have even crossed my mind. And I'm simply doing it because I believe at the moment that it is incredibly important for Europe to be able to defend itself. And number two, I think in the Ukraine conflict, I think it is incredibly important that Ukraine is able to defend itself. In addition to that, that is the primary motivation around this. And I come at it from a perspective of not wanting to see more war, but I want to see an even better deterrence. And it was clear to me that with AI and all these new tools, the only way in effect to protect yourself is actually having that capability yourself. And that's sort of why I no matter where we fall on the scale, I think it's important to state that.
Daniel, you built the biggest and most important music platform in the world. I used to be an unsuccessful jazz musician, so we both cared about music, and we are today both pretty politically interested, or in your case, I would say you are a real political animal, meanwhile. What made you so interested in politics? Why are you leaning in so much? Is there an epiphany? Is there one special moment that changed you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You say that I'm a political animal. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult, but I don't know that I care too much about politics. I care about policies and certain types of policies. And again, my key goal at this point is I've been more fortunate and more successful than I ever thought was imaginable. And I've come to view that technology is this magical thing that enables prosperity. And it truly is one of those things that enables us to solve many, if not all, of the biggest problems in the world. And when I then look at Europe, which is, my home region, and my home country of Sweden and all the neighboring countries that I love so dearly, I think it is really important that we succeed with entrepreneurship, we succeed with innovation, and we keep developing new technologies to enable more prosperity. And so I care deeply about that, and I want to make that happen. And to the extent that I get involved in policy or politics, it is to enable that. I want to see more innovation. I want to see Europe do better than what it has, because it truly is an amazing place. That's why I care. I don't know that I necessarily have an opinion about party politics otherwise. It is more around entrepreneurship, innovation, and technology being a force for good.
Yeah, and your European patriotism, or our mutual love for Europe, the most beautiful continent in the world, which leads me to my very last question, Daniel. I just want to challenge your optimism a little bit, or apart from what you wish and what we hope, what you really think, what would you bet on? So Europe, 10 years down the road, will it do better or will it do worse with regard to growth, value creation, innovation, deregulation, transatlantic alliance, and defense? Are you long or are you short?
The easy short answer is I'm long. I'm staying in Europe, and I love Europe, and I'm going to make it happen. But the more nuanced answer is I think the next 10 years is going to be very defining for Europe. on what type of future we play. I would on average say that there's too much pessimism and too many people have already sort of almost given up, and hence why you can see me lean in more and being the more optimist. But the realist in me says that it's down to execution, like always, and it's not a foregone conclusion, whichever direction we end up being in. But let me argue why I'm long on Europe for a short moment. I think we have an enormous amount of talent in Europe that's undertapped. We have, if you look at the AI, the greatest field, if you look at the sort of heads of the various AI teams in the world, it is mostly, if not solely, Europeans at the top of those companies. And we keep forgetting, although they're owned by Americans, but there are two massive AI labs in Europe, Meta's FAIR being one and Google's DeepMind being the other, headed up from Europe, where massive amounts of European talent is contributing to the field. On open source, which is, I think, under-talked about, Europe has more than twice the amount of open source developers that, for instance, America has, that are contributing to software development around the world, software technology. We have amazing talents in materials science, in many other fields from our universities too, and some enormous breakthroughs. What we do lack is we lack a way of forcing these through in new innovation and scaling those innovations. That is partly due to some of the things we talked about today. It's partly capital problems as well that we should figure out. For instance, why is a seed round in the US twice as big as the one in Europe? Whereas an A round is 2/3 about the same. There are gaps here where we have to try to fix them. But I think if we do, the talent is certainly here. And if we can alter the mindset, I think Europe has a very, very great future ahead of itself. And I see a lot of amazing entrepreneurs coming up. And we just need to nurture them, and I think greatness will come. So I'm long Europe, and I'm excited to be building European companies and hopefully pay forward to many other great European entrepreneurs that is building at the moment.
In your wonderful long answer, there was one very short sentence that I loved most, and that was, I'm gonna make it happen. So, Daniel, let's make it happen. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.